The origin of all keyboard switches is Cherry MX. Everything else is a clone. That's what purists would tell you. Gateron, clone. JWK, clone. Zeal? Honestly, Zeal sells Gateron switches and just charges extra. Hi, my name is Danny Nguyen, and I've been in the keyboard hobby since late 2019, and we're going to talk about the history of switches, what I've learned, and my suggestions for you going into the future. Cherry in Germany is responsible for giving birth to the MX style keyboard switch in the 1980s. The patent for these switches finally expired in 2014, which was when alternatives flooded the market. And before we get started, what is a keyboard switch? Well, it's a thing you interact with. Your finger touches a keycap, which sits on a switch, like this one, and it's in a PCB, which is a printed circuit board, which communicates with your computer to register a keystroke, key, whatever. It's a pretty basic system. The switch itself is quite tiny. It's a top housing, bottom housing, spring, leaf, and stem. You smack it to bottom out, and when you let go, it also makes a sound as it hits the top housing. It's responsible for a portion of the sound and feel of a keyboard. By the time I got into the scene, Zeal was the luxury option for switches. Telios and Zelios were the options suggested by the few YouTubers I watched. We had a lot of Gateron options, which are admittedly very good as well. My first love, the Gateron Ink Black, was glass smooth and had a deep sound. It was my go-to for most things, and it looks cool. Gateron reds, browns, and yellows seemed a lot like the original Cherry switches, so they felt kind of boring. In 2019, if you wanted smooth, you would go for the Gateron Ink Black or Telios. If you wanted the Cherry sound, you can use MX Blacks. You wanted tactiles, you want MX Brown perhaps, but typically you would be pointed toward Telios. There were a few other options, but these stood ahead of the pack. By Q1 2020, a new switch became popular, the Alpaca. This was a JWK switch. JWK was another factory in China making MX style switches. Clones, you could say. As I mentioned in prior videos, Duroc and JWK were making extremely similar products. The Alpaca was sold exclusively by Prime KB and were based off of the SA Bliss colorway brought by Minterly, a designer and streamer in the keyboard space. It was glass smooth and brand new, so people were very excited about it. We had not mentioned materials of these switches prior to this point, but every manufacturer keeps the exact material breakdown close to the chest. We know Gateron doesn't release any information, Cherry uses some proprietary nylon blend, and the Alpaca here was using a polycarbonate top and a nylon bottom. The exact percentage of polycarbonate nylon, we don't know. The stems for almost all switches were typically palm, and you could honestly switch stems from switch to switch without having much of an issue. The sound generally is the same. So you could just swap stems around if you wanted a certain color, and overall, because each switch had different materials, we had a lot of what's called Franken switching. Franken switching is taking the parts from one switch and the parts of another switch and mixing them up. So in terms of the existing switches at the time, people liked the Cherry MX top out sound, but the switches are very scratchy sounding and the springs were country stock. Telios were extremely smooth, but extremely expensive. Gateron Inks had a special sound, but it wasn't as special as MX Blacks. People experimented and made their own switches by using different parts. It got extremely expensive. With Telios being around $1 a switch, Inks being around 75 cents per switch, the nice switches were expensive. Cherry MX Blacks were cheaper, but they were not smooth. People wanted smooth MX Blacks, they sought out vintage MX Blacks by harvesting them from old keyboards or paying $1 plus a switch for them. It was ridiculous. So when Alpacas came around at 55 cents each, it was a freaking deal. And you didn't have to swap parts to try to get a smooth switch. People ended up using the Cherry MX top in other switches. So cheap Cherry MX Black, but it's not smooth, so they just took that top and swapped it with the top of another switch. We'll get back to this in a minute. They were so popular that they sold out instantly. This release was when the pandemic was peaking and people realized that they weren't gonna go anywhere. They needed a hobby, they needed something to do while being stuck in their homes. People rushed into keyboards and bought anything that they could. Honestly, these switches were being resold for almost $2 a switch when the original price was 55 cents. And that's because of supply. The supply was obliterated and a lot of people wanted them, so people were reselling on the secondhand market for flip price. You see, JWK became the new best budget option. It was not the cheapest, like Gateron switches or Cherry switches, but they were a damn good switch. The Alpacas existed and sold out, but there were Duroc options which had the same sound, like the Duroc L7. These were purchasable any day of the week on AliExpress, but people did not care. They wanted Alpacas. Once Alpacas proved to vendors that switches sold instantly, recently they saw the gold rush. They realized that if they ordered the right switch, got the right marketing behind it, they could sell out stock instantly and make a lot of money. A lot of pandemic companies came about this time, selling switches and peripherals like springs, films, switches. The recolors for switches came, a lot of them. So these vendors could talk to a middleman that would talk to the factories, pick from the catalog of parts, pick colors, name the switch, brand it, and sell it over here and make a killing, especially since everything was selling out so quickly. Honestly, a lot of these switches ended up being the same thing. Generally, they were almost all polycarbonate top, palm stem, nylon bottom linears with different spring weights, which is part of the catalog process, and different colors and names. But people ate them up. You see, buying keyboards are extremely difficult. Stock was low, demand was high, everything was selling out instantly, and things were really expensive. Even now, today, you can buy keyboards basically any day of the week, just not any keyboard that you want. There's plenty of in-stock options, but it's still a few $100s of commitment to try to change your typing experience. Whereas a switch, a few cents per switch, it's not bad at all. Let's just not do the math with shipping and realize that 90 switches at 55 cents each is over $50 once everything was said and done. FOMO, or the fear of missing out, ruled people's lives. If the switch sold out, then you'd have to buy it aftermarket. And if you didn't buy aftermarket, you'd be left behind. What if you had an endgame keyboard and you were stuck using Gateron yellows? What would you ever do? The origin of the switch gold rush is all we really needed to touch upon. The next rush was the long pole stem, which was a bunch of the same. Recolors of the JWK switches with cute names being pushed by keyboard influencers like myself. This is when I decided that reviewing switches was a lost cause. I honestly got bored of it. They all sounded very similar and I was becoming neurotic trying to listen to the differences. I slowly stopped reviewing switches and I slowly watched as a lot of vendors had to close their doors in 2022 when the hobby started normalizing. As we saw technology progress, more competition came, but JWK ruled a lot of the market. Texi as a manufacturer, has stepped up to make a lot of good switches, the Zaku being one of them, and a lot of the recolors. Aphelion is a brand new name that has come in and has proven to be a worthy competitor with good factory lubing, but honestly, all manufacturers have caught up. I even grabbed a switch to look at recently, the Gateron Gecko Silent Linear Switch, and it was top tier. Sold by Kinetic Labs, and the names and the description of the switch is basically all you need to know. Gateron Silent Linear. So silent switches have been around for a long time, but they've been mushy and kind of scratchy sounding. Gateron has actually picked up on the factory lubing aspect of their business, so I think a lot of Gateron switches are usable stock. This right here is a Gecko, silent linear, but with the most modern technology and manufacturing prowess. Typically, linear switches, even the Alpaca silent linear, it feels mushy on the bottom out, it sounds weird on the top out, and it's just not a fun typing experience if you at least like the sound and feel. That was my experience with most silent switches, especially from JWK. Gateron is a veteran of the game, they've been making switches forever, so they stepped in and worked with Kinetic Labs to use stiffer dampeners to change the feel of the switch. As I type with this, there's no reduced travel. My personal preference is to not have reduced travel because it feels like I'm typing into a brick wall, while retaining the silent aspect. It's not very loud, it's not loud at all really. The stiffer dampeners was just a technological advance as we get to the point where almost every switch is good. So you have to find new ways to make your switch different. This switch is smooth from the factory. You don't have to lube the stem at all. The spring is not crunchy, not pingy, and you can just grab it and put it in any keyboard, especially one with the purpose of being used for work or being used in a room that's shared with someone else, and be ready to go. And that is just something that did not exist in 2019. We didn't have switches that could be used stock, and we didn't have silent switches that didn't have some kind of weakness. And that's just where we are today. I think most switches these days are not going to be scratchy. The factory lube options are stellar, and you can actually skip the monotonous process of lubing and filming switches for a lot of them, and they're ready to go. We've gone from just using Cherry MX Blacks, which is scratchy and have a lot of stem wobble, and the springs sound gross, and you need to lube them, and you have to take all this time. And today you can grab a switch and put it in a keyboard and be in great shape. And it's not even gonna cost that much. You don't have to buy a 75-cent switch anymore. Most new switches are viable, and I will just take care to make sure that I'm just not buying a recolor of an existing switch. Even if it's just a spring swap, like I'd rather just buy a spring and use my current switch rather than buying a brand new Switch. There's not that much progression in technology of Switches anymore. Luckily for us, we're not stuck between one of 3 options for a Switch. You can find very good 20-cent switches that can use stock like TTC switches or JWIG. You can get the trusty old JWIG switches for around 50 cents. You can go a little bit more expensive and get a long pole sound for a bit more than 50 cents. If you want, you can try to spend more into some experimental technology like Zeo clickies that can be transformed into a tactile linear clicky. The people that do that probably buy guac at Chipotle. I'm not one of those people. My only advice to you now, as someone who's been in the game for a while, don't buy any Switches aftermarket for over $1 a Switch. Izaku is one of those Switches that people overpay for. And I know things like Hyros and vintage MX Blacks exist, but options available today are going to be better than those. Feel free to experiment around, but know that every time you try a new Switch, it's going to be like over 50 bucks. If you do that every other week, it's going to add up. Be smart.
Do the right thing.
Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.